Hello everybody and welcome to Mr. Stansfield's education videos. Today we're talking about depth of field. Now depth of field, I think probably the easiest and most widely understood way to describe depth of field is to think about the portrait mode on your cell phone. So when you hit portrait mode on your cell phone, the background becomes blurry if you're taking a portrait, but we also know it can work on other things like still lifes. If I want to get a nice blurry background of like my pumpkin spice latte at Starbucks. I want to take a picture of that coffee. I can put it in portrait mode. The background becomes blurry. The thing that we want to know about depth of field is that actually portrait mode is mimicking depth of field. It's mimicking one kind of depth of field, or one setting, perhaps, is a better way to say that. Depth of field, the technical definition of depth of field can be a little confusing, but the technical definition of depth of field is this: the range of acceptable sharpness in an image. And let's dive into that a little bit, okay? The range of acceptable sharpness, the way that I like to think about depth of field is actually what is in focus from front to back in the photo. Right now in this video, I'm sharp, and then pretty much everything behind me is also relatively sharp, or acceptably sharp, we might say. If there was a smaller depth of field, or a smaller depth of focus, maybe sometimes it's easier to think about it that way, what you would see is actually a blurry background over here. As you know, the depth in the photo, you would have the focus be on me, and then the rest of it would become blurry. Now I can't mimic that here with this particular video, but we'll look at some example photos in just a minute. What are the three things that control depth of field? There are three things that control depth of field. They are aperture, so that's the aperture setting or the f-stop on the camera that you're using. Distance, how close you are to the subject, how close the camera is to the subject. So that camera to subject distance, that's the second thing. And the third thing that controls depth of field is the focal length, or the size of the lens, or the zoom setting, so how zoomed in you are. This doesn't really compute or equate to cell phones. Cell phones are kind of a little bit of an exception to all of these things, except for distance. If you get closer to your subject, your depth of field should narrow. So those are the three things that control depth of field. Let's start by looking at f-stop or aperture. So of course, on a mechanical manual camera, you manually rotate the aperture ring dial. And this particular lens, you can see there's a little red diamond right here. And the red diamond, let's go ahead and line it up here so you can actually read the numbers. The red diamond right now is lined up with f22. And at f22, the aperture setting is this tiny little hole, this tiny little opening. And as this aperture ring rotates, the number will change. Let's go all the way open. And so will the f-stop. So in this case right now, the f-stop is set to f2, and the size of the opening in the lens is the largest that this particular lens allows. You also may have noticed when I hold the lens up to the video camera here, it refocuses, and then I actually get a little bit blurry over here. So there's your distance controlling depth of field. Okay, let's go back here real quick to the aperture setting. So the aperture setting on the lens will change the depth of field. And here's what you need to know. The smaller the number, f2, the smaller the depth of field. It's also good to know that it's a larger opening. So the larger the opening, the larger the aperture itself, the smaller the depth of field. And then if we go the other direction, the smaller the opening, the bigger the depth of field is. And so when you have your aperture setting at, say, f22, that's the smallest setting on this particular lens, you're going to have the range of acceptable sharpness be quite large. The depth of focus is quite large. What is in focus from front to back is quite large. And on the other end of that spectrum, f2, the size of the opening is large, the number is smaller, f2, but the depth of field is smaller. So the larger the opening, the smaller the depth of field. The smaller the opening, the larger the depth of field. And again, what is depth of field? It's that range of sharpness. What is in focus from front to back? If you want one single thing to be sharp from front to back, use a larger aperture, a larger opening. Smaller f number, but larger opening. If you want everything to be focused from front to back, you want everything to be sharp from front to back, use a smaller aperture, smaller opening, larger depth of field, larger f number. So that's the relationship as it connects to aperture. Let's talk about distance, because I think that's actually the easiest, and then we'll talk about focal length. Of course, like we just sort of showed, right? If I take my hand and I get up close here, you can see the camera will focus on my hand. You see my hand in detail, and then my face back here, I'm a little bit blurry. So that range of acceptable sharpness gets smaller as the camera to subject distance gets smaller. So if you're trying to minimize the depth of field or get that, sometimes we call it selective focus. If you're trying to get that selective focus, get closer to the subject. If you're trying to maximize your depth of field, make that range of acceptable sharpness or what's in focus from front to back, you can get a little bit further away from your subject. So you can play with that distance a little bit. Finally, you've got focal length, or the zoom setting, or the lens selection. And again, this doesn't really pertain to zooming on a cell phone. We're really talking about cameras that have the ability to zoom to actually change the physical, optical qualities of the lens itself. Some lenses zoom, some lenses don't. We call that focal length is actually the size of the lens, or the zoom setting, focal length. And let's think about it in the context of a zoom lens. As you zoom in, or as your lens becomes more telephoto, or the larger the focal length, your depth of field gets smaller. And so that's why you'll see a lot of times portrait photographers use bigger lenses. They'll get a little bit further away from their subject, but use a bigger lens, and that will minimize the depth of field, so you get that nice creamy portrait mode type blurry background. They'll also shoot with a large aperture and minimize how far they are actually away from the subject. But you can't always do all three, and you don't always want to do all three. Each of these three things does control depth of field, but sometimes you're relying on one of those or two of those things more than all three of them at the same time. If you're trying to maximize the depth of field, you can select a wider angle lens. As you zoom out and have a wider field of view, those lenses, wider angle lenses, have more depth of field than more telephoto lenses. So those are the three things that control depth of field. And as you're making pictures and trying to minimize or maximize your depth of field, you want to be thinking about all three of those things together and making creative choices about which of those three things to use, depending on the kind of picture that you're taking. If you're making a portrait, chances are you're probably going to want to choose a more telephoto lens and probably shoot with a relatively large aperture. Distance is less important in that scenario. If you're taking a landscape picture and you want to have a very large depth of field, potentially you're going to want to choose a wider angle focal length and or a smaller aperture to get that larger depth of field. Use all three of these in conjunction with each other to make the best picture that you can.
Let's take a look at some examples now. Let's start with narrow depth of field. A small or narrow depth of field is going to highlight or focus on one thing, and then everything in front of or behind that thing, that focal point or that focus point, will be blurry. In this example, there is the center of the eye and some eyelashes that are sharp, and everything else becomes blurry. With a narrow depth of field, this glass ball is sharp, everything else is blurry. In our next example, the book is sharp and everything else is blurry. Now let's take a look at the other end of the spectrum. If you're trying to maximize depth of field, you want everything to be sharp, or as much as possible. In this case, the foreground, middle ground, and background is all sharp. And the way that the photographer achieves this effect is by using a small aperture, a wider angle lens and by giving some distance between the camera and the subject. You see this often with landscape pictures, like these pictures that we're looking at right now. Maximizing depth of field, everything is sharp from front to back. I like this picture because it includes some shutter speed blur as well. So the foreground, rock, and background, mountain, the bridge, and trees are all sharp. The reason that the water is blurry is because of the shutter speed that was chosen. I wanted to end on this picture because we can see that it's a relatively narrow depth of field. The dog is in focus, and what's in front of and behind the dog is slightly blurrier. This isn't the narrowest depth of field. We can still tell that there are people behind the dog, and we can still tell what's going on in the scene, the boardwalk, the trees, etc. But I did want to draw our attention to this blurry tree here to the left of the picture. It's a little distracting. And I just wanted to bring our attention to this and note that oftentimes when you have a narrow depth of field and something in the foreground is blurry, our eye is often distracted by that. So keep that in mind. Typically you want to, if you are going to have something in the foreground that's blurry, that's fine. But I think typically, oftentimes this is what happens. If you have something in the foreground that's big and blurry, our eye goes to it. It's not especially pleasing. And so just be careful of that. I think the other examples of the narrow depth of field, you have a single subject that's in focus, and our eye goes to that. That's the reason why the photographer focused on that and used a narrow depth of field. So I hope that helped.